It's time to talk about something uncomfortable, something which happens in our society all too often, but which mainstream news outlets don't like talking about: rape. There is a conception among many people, I think, that rape is a highly rare event perpetrated by crazed people. The stereotypical rape narrative of a stranger jumping on a woman in a dark alley is common, and ultimately it's palatable. It doesn't require us as a society to think about the social norms about consent and about widespread problematic beliefs around gender and sex. Currently, in this political climate, terms like norms and gender have become charged political terms which sometimes trigger immediate disengagement and a rejection of change. But this is, or at least should be, a bipartisan, non-political issue. Mothers, daughters, sisters, grandmas, female friends, if you have any of these, then regardless of your political standing, you owe it to them to be open-minded on hearing about these issues. But this article is not a political polemic. We're just looking at scientific studies here. Nor is this at all intended to be a misandrist, generalizing narrative blaming all men for doing bad things, or accusing male readers. I am myself a man, and I strongly believe that discussing immoral behavior in our society needs to be a cause of everyone, regardless of gender. If you are reading this and are a man, it's even more important that you keep reading, or listening in this case. None of this is meant to point a finger at you. Both you and me are on the same side, both reacting to the same thing. And of course, women can perpetrate sexual violence too, and men can be victimized. Many of the studies which I'll cite here actually discuss female rates of sexual violence perpetration and male rates of victimization. These are important statistics which I believe should be popularized and examined. However, in this article, I wanted to take the time to discuss violence perpetrated by men against women. That's not because I want to demonize men. In fact, the effect may be the opposite, because by condemning a given proportion of individuals, one vindicates the remainder. Rather, it's just to bring attention to an issue which I feel should be discussed more, and which I think is indicative of a broader injustice in society. That issue is how common rape is in our society. This is not an easy thing to try and figure out. Because rape is so stigmatized, underreported, and underdiscussed, many people do not have an accurate intuition on rape incidence rates. Police report data is also a poor source of information precisely because rape is so underreported. Rape Crisis England and Wales reports that 5 out of 6 women don't notify the police after being raped. The only way to really know how common rape is, then, is by asking people. Of course, this is an imperfect method. The most salient flaw here is selection bias. If researchers put out surveys asking people whether they've been victimized or whether they've perpetrated a crime, who is more likely to respond? People are voluntarily choosing to give their time to filling out these surveys, and some people may be more likely to do this than others. For example, people who have been victimized would potentially be more likely to respond to a survey asking about it, which means that the proportion of survey takers who have been victimized could be greater than the proportion of victimized women in the whole society. Another issue is that no study can actually poll every person in a country. Instead, they poll samples of people, usually of several thousand. These samples will be intended to be as representative of the broader population as possible, but there's still a random chance that the sample might overrepresent or underrepresent the rates of perpetration or victimization. Therefore, it's essential to look at as many studies as possible and look at the average rates, because averages, spanning much more data, are less susceptible to the vagaries of random chance. Unfortunately, however, research on this topic is shockingly sparse considering the gravity of it. All this is to say that these statistics must be viewed with skepticism and caution. They can give us very rough ideas on how common something is, but the specific numbers aren't the be-all and end-all. Nonetheless, it is still essential to see the numbers and to update our view on society accordingly. Much of the following paragraphs are, in fact, borrowed from a larger article I wrote about systemic sexism in general, although you don't at all need to read that in order to make sense of this current article. There have been 3 large-scale surveys in the UK asking women anonymously whether they've ever been raped. Because different people have different ideas of how rape is defined, the methodology of these surveys asks people things like whether someone has ever used physical force or the threat of physical force to penetrate someone. The lowest estimate of rape rates comes from the Crime Survey for England and Wales, a very authoritative source published by the Office of National Statistics and surveying around 30,000 Britons from many different backgrounds and demographics. They reported that 7.3% of all women had been raped at some point in their lives. That's around 1 in 14 of every woman you'll meet. See source 1. Another estimate comes from the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles 3, another UK-wide survey harnessing data from 15,162 adults across the country. They reported that about 1 in 10 women had been raped. See source 2. And finally, Rape Crisis England and Wales, using representative data from the Office of National Statistics, reports that 1 in 4 adult women, 1 in 4, have been raped since the age of 16. See source 3. So in summary, that's a range of estimates from about 8% to about 25%. But again, there's not that many data points here. There's only 3. And the classic question always asked is, why don't these women go to the police? In fact, studies have sought to investigate this as well, and the most common reason is that women didn't think the police would do anything about it, see sources 3 and 4. So they'd be asked about this horrible traumatic event over and over again, constantly reliving that experience with no justice ever being done. And this is in fact what happens in reality. Due to massive underfunding, less than 3% of reported rapes in the UK led to a conviction by the Crown Prosecution Service in 2024 to 2025. See source 5. And even when convictions do occur, they can be as little as 4 years before the rapist is free again and may seek revenge. See source 6. By the way, this isn't just a UK problem, it's worldwide. In the US, for example, the National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence Survey reported in 2010 that around 1 in 5 women had been subject to attempted or completed rape. See source 7. And we also see these kinds of rates in developed countries across the world. Estimates for the incidence rates of rape against women varies a lot by study, so often scientists will conduct literature reviews, where they compile and compare lots of studies, often dozens. I've attached one of these sources here so you can take a look for yourself. You can see that this 1 in 5 rate is not an isolated anomaly, see source 8. But coercion is a spectrum. At one end is the outright use of physical force, but when you broaden the definition of coercion to penetrate, do things like verbal threats and pressure, constantly arguing with someone until you grind down their will to resist, deliberately getting someone too intoxicated to meaningfully resist, or getting visibly angry at someone, the rates of verbal sexual coercion for penetrative sex are even higher. The literature often uses the term sexual coercion to refer to a situation where a woman is compelled to have sex even when physical force or explicit threat is absent. To be clear, this is legally still rape. This is rape by coercion. But the term sexual coercion is still used here when paraphrasing results from the literature. Again, there are lots of studies on this with a wide range of results, so we need to look at averages and remember there's a wide range here. Also, essentially all of these studies are on university women, and the rates of victimization are higher here than the general population, which is important to keep in mind. Almost all of this literature is based on the USA, and not all studies from the 2020s. 2 other important caveats. Considering the importance of the topic, again, the paucity of research here is extremely stark. Nonetheless, the rates in US university women are so high that it's likely that in all US populations, and by extension British, and by extension the developed world, rates of rape by coercion are high as well. A 2018 literature review examining multiple studies found that victimization rates ranged from 1 in 5, 20%, to around 4 in 5, 78%. The authors also noted that generally, studies have shown that around 1 in 2 US university women have experienced sexual coercion, see source 9. In many of these studies, though, the rate was higher than 1 in 2. For example, 2 separate studies reported the rate as being 3 out of 4 women having experienced sexual coercion, see sources 10 and 11. Surveying Britons across multiple different ages and demographics, a landmark British study which surveyed over 22,000 women noted that 55% of them, over half, had been coerced into penetrative sex. See source 12. Of course, these numbers are all snapshots of samples of people. It doesn't at all guarantee that around 1 in 2 women in developed countries, as a rule of thumb, have been coerced into sex. But it does give us a very rough ballpark and gives us some understanding of how massive this issue is. But who's doing this? What proportion of men are responsible? First of all, it's essential to dispel the myth that the prototypical rapist is a violent stranger attacking someone in the street. 6 out of 7 women are raped by people they already know. See source 13. This is not a tiny minority of crazed individuals. This is a much more average, common type of person. In fact, there are many studies which anonymously ask men whether they've ever used physical force or the threat of it to penetrate someone. The results gathered vary a lot by study based on the methods they use, the populations they survey, etc., etc. All very expected in scientific sampling. So what is this range? In developed countries, when looking at both university and general population samples, the rates of male rape perpetration, as freely confessed to, range from 6% to 15%, usually converging at around 7 to 8%, see source 14. That's about 1 in 13 men. But again, when we look at sexual coercion as a whole, rather than specifically rape as in using physical force or the threat of physical force, these numbers shoot up. One of the highest quality pieces of evidence here is a meta-analysis from 2023. Not all scientific studies are created equal, and a meta-analysis is the best kind because it's like a study of studies. It crunches data from multiple studies, giving an idea of what the overall literature points to. This meta-analysis utilized 60 studies and in total nearly 27,000 participants. It found that in both university and general settings and across lots of developed countries, around 3 out of 10 men, nearly a third, have coerced someone into sex. See source 15. Again, this is an average and there's lots of variation. You may find sources which cherry pick one of the lowest estimates to downplay the problem, and of course the opposite is true. In fact, looking over the literature, in most of these studies, the coercion rate is around or over half, but the meta-analysis weighted different studies unevenly according to perceived reliability. For example, one study found that 65.3% of men in a study based in Detroit had committed coercion, and 24.5% had outright raped someone. See source 16. The highest rates of the many studies analysed in a huge meta-analysis of 27 EU countries reported that up to 4 out of 5 men had perpetrated sexual coercion. See source 17. I know that these are shocking statistics which seem like they can't be real. Your instinct may be immediately to doubt and dismiss this, and I'm not asking you to blindly take my word for it. I actually think it's essential that you don't blindly trust people on the internet and exercise a healthy skepticism. But I put all the sources here for you to go and take a look at yourself. And if you want to criticize the methodology and dismiss the results, that's up to you. But at least engage with this evidence and don't just ignore it out of hand. The point is not whether the real male perpetration rates of rape and sexual coercion are exactly as found in the literature. We will never know exactly what these rates are because all scientific methodologies have flaws. The point is that it's not just a small minority of uniquely violent individuals. This is a broader issue, an issue of our society. Nobody is born as a rapist. If so many people are reaching that level, we need to ask ourselves why. As we discussed earlier, this is from the systemic sexism article. We didn't discuss this earlier. However, crime correlates with beliefs. One of the biggest correlates found in studies of men who have perpetrated sexual coercion and rape is the connection between committing sexual assaults and believing in rape myths. See source 18. Rape myths are ideas which serve to justify or rationalize rape. Here are some examples from repeat offenders who were interviewed in a study. Quote, for example, one repeat assaulter believed that the first woman he assaulted was just being hard to get and called his second assault just another night. Another repeat assaulter believed that most women say no at first most times. A man has to persist to determine if she really means it. One repeat assaulter who described a rape at both time points wrote, I felt as if I had gotten something that I was entitled to, and I felt I was repaying her for sexually arousing me. A different repeat assaulter who forced anal sex on a blind date reported that he was trying to get something out of a dead-end date. End quote. See source 13. All of these ideas, the notions that women owe men sex if they get aroused, or that a lack of consent is just being hard to get, are things which we see in our society. In fact, in a 1978 study of high school students, over half of all males surveyed thought that it was acceptable for a man to force sex with a woman if she led him on, changed her mind, or aroused him. See source 19. Of course, we aren't living in 1978 anymore. But these ideas were held by the majority of people in a sample from a previous time, and these ideas haven't gone away now. But all these perpetrators studied and quoted didn't acquire these ideas in a vacuum. And it's not just rape myths, it's the language around how people talk about women, language that we see as normalized in our culture today. A study showed that 17 and 18-year-old men who used derogatory language towards women, exactly the kind of language that we talked about earlier in the systemic sexism article, were more likely to engage in sexual violence. See source 13. And rape and sexual coercion is also repeatedly correlated with perceptions of traditional gender roles, such as that men should be dominant and aggressive, and women should be submissive and accepting. See sources 20 and 21. These phenomena, stereotypes, rape myths, derogatory language, which we find in our culture, are what people refer to when they are using the term rape culture. Rapists are not born overnight, they are made, and evil acts come from being socialized bit by bit into thinking it's okay. Human beings find it difficult to be cruel to fellow human beings. But if somebody is a bitch or a whore or a slut, then they're not a person, they are that name. An example is the complete ubiquity of groping, which is a form of sexual assault. You can see this for yourself in any older film, or you can just ask your parents about it. Groping is not just a bit of fun or boys being boys. It is the casual assertion of the assaulter's sovereignty over a woman's own body. And this is legitimated by another ubiquitous trope which we see in our society. The idea that women are irrational or hormonal. The stereotype of female irrationality is essential for legitimating harm against them because it allows a woman's feelings to be dismissed as sentimental or overreacting. The irrationality stereotype allows women's autonomy to be ignored in the exact same way as a child's. Her desires can be overruled by arguing that she is not cognitively competent enough to have legitimate ones. Whenever she is groped or mistreated, her process can then be trivialized in the same way a toddler's tantrum is. She can be told to stop sulking or get over it. The toddler analogy, by the way, is not an exaggeration. Legally, women have been treated like children for the vast majority of human history. In the West, it took until the late 20th century for women to even be able to open a bank account independently of a male's permission, for domestic abuse to be recognized as a crime, and for marital rape to be recognized as a crime. In most countries, both women and children are still under the cultural ownership of their male head of household, be that their father or their husband. Now, naturally, not all adherents to traditional gender norms will carry the implications of these norms to this extent, believing, for example, that domestic abuse should be legal. But the extent to which people think of women as bitches or sex objects or as sentimental idiots, in other words, the extent to which people think of women as things which are not like them, a human being, is variable. Dehumanization is a spectrum. And such a large proportion of men admitted to having perpetrated rape because our society does not have meaningful guardrails and barriers along this spectrum. It is not being discussed enough, and as a result, large numbers of people can drift into the darker end of this spectrum and commit violence. If dehumanization is facilitated by cultural beliefs, then sexual violence is a cultural issue. And this is why it's so important to discuss things like traditional gender norms. These aren't just abstract academic issues. These have real human consequences. Rape is not an isolated issue confined to a minority of crazed individuals. It's a widespread cultural issue that comes from how people are brought up thinking about women. And until we talk about that issue, it isn't going to go away. And yet, out of all the large British newspapers, the only one I could find that even mentioned sexual violence perpetration statistics even once was The Guardian. Sexual violence and rape culture cannot be made into a political issue. It is a bipartisan concern which affects everyone. Everyone has a mother. And this means that every newspaper of every stripe should be talking about this. Every politician should be prioritizing, thinking of ways to stop it, and every voter needs to be supportive of such measures. And if you're listening, you may be a man and thinking, I would never do any of this. This isn't me. And nobody's trying to say otherwise. None of this article is an accusation or an attack. It's just all to say that this issue does exist. And if we want society to get better, we have to talk about it. So if you know someone who has these beliefs, who's slipping into this way of thinking, who's showing signs, don't ignore it. Don't do nothing. Just talk to them. Because being good on the inside doesn't affect anything. You have to be good actively. You may not be part of the problem, but that doesn't automatically make you part of the solution. There's a fantastic clip about this from a comedian, Daniel Sloss, who ignored these signs on one of his friends, and that friend raped someone. It's sourced here, see source 22. And to quote that video, if you think this does not affect the women in your life, talk to them and watch your world crumble before your very eyes. It's not because it's not happening to them, it's because they don't trust you enough